back to this lecture series for ethics. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of the ethics of St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, in our previous video, we saw that really the foundation of Aquinas' ethical system is this idea that man is made in the image of God. And we discussed to some extent the respect in which man is made in the image of God, but perhaps more importantly for our purposes is that if the entire system is based on this idea that man is a reflection or image of God, then that would seem to tell us something important about what the final or ultimate good of a human being is. It would suggest that the final or ultimate good of a human being would have to be something like reuniting or communing with God. If God is ultimately what completes us, if we are a mere reflection or image of God, then it seems that we could find our complete or ultimate fulfillment and satisfaction in God somehow. And in fact, that's what we see Aquinas arguing, and that's what we're going to look at in this video. So the first thing to say here is let's recall what we talked about last time, that both Aristotle and Aquinas are united in this idea that there is one ultimate end of human life. Both don't think it's plausible to think that there could be many ultimate ends, because then none of those would be sufficient all in themselves. If we think there is some final ultimate good that is complete and self-sufficient, we must just think there is one. And of course, when we think about what Aristotle had to say about this ultimate end, we'll recall that he thought our ultimate end is, as he says in this passage, happiness, which is a sort of living well and acting well. And we saw that he explained what it means to live well and act well by saying it's a certain sort of activity in accordance with reason. It's using our reason and our rational capacities to think about how a human being ought to act, to avoid deficiency or excess in our qualities of our person, and ultimately to develop virtue. That's what Aristotle thought that our ultimate end is. Now, one thing we should see is that although, and we'll discuss this further as we go, although Aristotle does think a life of contemplation is sort of the best life for a human being, he also thinks that our happiness is inherently practical, right? It has to do with sort of determining how do I become courageous, how do I become temperate, how do I fulfill my function as a human being by developing virtue. And one thing you might notice is this is a goal you can continue to strive for, right? So you might say, well, I can always sort of find, even if I'm a very courageous person, I can probably be a little better at it. Even if I'm very honest, I can be a little better at it, determining when to tell the whole truth, determining when to maybe keep certain things hidden given the context, right? If you think that becoming virtuous is this interplay between excess and deficiency of certain tendencies we have, then you can imagine sort of fine-tuning that for an entire life. Always using your reason and your rational faculty to become just a little bit better, a little bit more virtuous. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it suggests that for Aristotle, happiness really isn't a final destination at all. In fact, happiness is a constant activity. It's an activity which you can always strive to become better at. And I think this is very important because it highlights an important difference between Aristotle and Aquinas. So let's take a look at how Aquinas characterizes this one ultimate end, which is the good of a human being. As I mentioned last time, he calls it beatitude. And what beatitude is, he tells us, is a perfect good that puts the appetite totally to rest. So there's two important points here. First, beatitude is a perfect good. That means there's nothing bad about it. There's nothing deficient or evil about it. And that will become important as we continue through his reasoning. But for the moment, look at this idea that according to Aquinas, our final good is something that puts the appetite totally to rest. As I described in our previous video, beatitude is something that puts an end to our striving. It puts an end to the sort of constant structure that we find that characterizes our lives, where we have some goal, we have some end that we're trying to achieve, and we undertake some action to get there. We feel dissatisfied until we're at that destination, and then once we're at that destination, we have a new goal, and we're dissatisfied till we accomplish that. So when Aquinas says that our ultimate good is something that puts that to rest, he's ultimately saying that our ultimate good is something that puts that structure of activity to rest. Our ultimate good will be a state in which we have no more desires, we have nothing to strive for, we have nothing to act for the sake of. We will be able to exist in a sort of state of eternal and total and ultimate satisfaction and bliss. And notice that we don't get that from Aristotle, right? From Aristotle, we get a sort of our happiness is a constant activity of trying to improve ourselves. And Aquinas would agree, in this life, we should do that. We should constantly try to become more virtuous. But because Aquinas is working in a Christian worldview that Aristotle was not working in, Aquinas is going to say that our ultimate good isn't to be found in just in perfecting ourselves in this life, but in something beyond this life, in a state which lies beyond our physical existence, and a state in which we unite with God and can ultimately put our desiring, our striving, and what he calls our appetite finally to rest. And I think this is an important distinction from Aristotle, because although Aquinas agrees with Aristotle on many points, he thinks we have to have an ultimate end, and it must be a single ultimate end, it must be complete and self-sufficient. Aquinas is going to say you can't have that single, complete, and self-sufficient end without God, without the creative being, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, that is responsible for your existence, and of which you are an image, and which you will eventually be reunited with. Now, if we accept that human beings have one final ultimate end, an end that puts their appetites completely to rest, then the next question we have to ask is, well, what is that end? Now, of course, to some extent, I've given the game away here. I've told you that for Aquinas, that ultimate end is God, but it's important to see how he gets there. And he gets there in a process very similar to how Aristotle does. So you'll remember, once Aristotle says, well, happiness is our ultimate end, then we need to find out what happiness is, and he rejects all these possibilities like wealth and pleasure, etc. We're going to see Aquinas do a similar thing, and at some points use some reasoning that was similar to the sort of reasoning that Aristotle uses. So the first thing he does, and remember, we're trying to identify a good that is both perfect and will put all our desiring to rest, all our appetite to rest. So the first two possibilities we'll look at are riches and honors, wealth and honor. And he says, well, wealth or riches can't be beatitude, it can't be our ultimate end, because just as Aristotle said, money and wealth is sought for the sake of something else, for the things we want to buy. So that can't be the ultimate end. It's actually like the paradigmatic example of something that cannot be an ultimate end, it's just a means to an end. What about honors? So honors are important, right? Being recognized for the good things you do, right? And of course we saw with Aristotle, this is actually a very important thing to pursue honor in the right way. It's what the person with greatness of soul does. And so Aquinas wouldn't disagree, honor isn't a bad thing, but it's also not an end in itself. It's not our ultimate good. So Aquinas tells us honor is a sign of and testimony to the excellence that exists in the one being honored. Why is honor important? Well, not primarily because of the honor itself. The honor is just the prize. What is important is the accomplishment you have done, which is produced some good effect for humanity, or has further developed a science, or furthered our knowledge, right? Whatever the good thing is you've done, that's what's important. The honor is sort of tacked on. It's the prize. So that can't be the complete and ultimate good, because if you, of course, were honored but didn't do anything significant, then the honor doesn't really mean anything. It's not good at all. So neither riches nor honors can be this complete and self-sufficient good that constitutes our beatitude. Okay, well, what about some other possibilities? He considers glory and fame, and this is similar to honor, but he gives a slightly different reason. The problem with glory and fame is it really depends on other people, it depends on their praise, and so just like Aristotle, he says, this is a good that makes us dependent on others, so that can't be beatitude. What about power? What about having influence? What about holding a high-powered job or a political office? What about having power over other people to make decisions? Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but remember that beatitude is not just a good that puts our appetite to rest. It's also a good that is perfect. And one of the things that Aquinas notices here is that power can be used for good or ill purposes. Power is open to what is both to what is good and to what is evil, whereas beatitude is men's proper and perfect good. So if you can use your power for ill to deceive and cheat and lie to other people and get what you want through nefarious means, if you can also do that through power, in addition to doing many good things, then again, power, like honor, like glory and fame, it's not necessarily bad, and it can be appropriate, but ultimately it cannot constitute our perfect human good. And he also considers this concept, which we saw when we looked at Aristotle, also in the Stoics, of external goods. Right, so again, by external goods, it means things like health, or wealth, or beauty, or all these sorts of things. Right, family and friends and good fortune. And he gives a number of familiar reasons for why our beatitude cannot be constituted by external goods either. Just like power, external goods can be used well, they can be used for good ends, or they can be used for evil ends, so they can't be a perfect good. They're also not self-sufficient, right? So if you have one external good like health, well, that might be great in and of itself, that you have a healthy body, that you're flourishing in that respect, but there's also many other external goods you won't have. You may not necessarily be wealthy, you may not necessarily be have knowledge, right? So there's all, and you may not necessarily have friends or other acquaintances who care about you, right? So to have any external good you pick out can't really constitute our ultimate end because it's not self-sufficient. And also, very importantly, and I think this shows an important similarity with the Stoics and Aristotle to some extent, but again also a point of departure, Aquinas emphasizes that external goods are subject to fortune. He tells us a man is ordered toward beatitude by internal principles, since he is naturally ordered to it. But the four goods discussed thus far, the external goods, come from exterior causes and very often from fortune. Whether you're healthy or you're poor, whether you're healthy or you're unhealthy, whether you're rich, whether you're poor, right? Whether you have friends or you don't have any friends, whether you have power or not, whether you have glory or not, all these things can just depend on many things outside of your control. And so another thing that wasn't necessarily made quite apparent in Aquinas' definition of beatitude is that beatitude must also be under our control. And I think it's important to draw a contrast here between Aquinas and the Stoics. Because the Stoics thought that as well to an extreme degree. They said we should reject any concern for external goods. Don't worry about if you're healthy. Don't worry about if you're rich. Don't worry about if you have friends or if you have power. Instead of desiring those things, what you should do is just limit your desires to what actually happens. So whatever your lot is in life, you should just desire that that's the way things go. And if you just focus on what you can control and changing your view of things, that is how you can become happy. Now, Aquinas agrees that whatever our good is should be within our control. But he also, remember, he wants it to be a good that is complete and utter satisfaction. Beatitude puts all our desires and striving to rest, not by eliminating those desires, not by getting rid of those desires, but by completely fulfilling every desire we have as a human being. The Stoic says, look, the problem is you want to be rich, but you're not rich. That's causing you distress. The solution, stop wanting to be rich. The problem is you want to be well-liked, or you want to have friends, but you don't have those things. Just get rid of those desires. But what Aquinas will say is, look, he agrees that desires for power and wealth and health aren't the most important desires. But what Aquinas notices is that the very fact that human beings are beings that strive for things, that we desire things, that we want things, shows that there's something lacking about this life. On our everyday lives, we're constantly striving after something, and then something else, and something else, and something else. And Aquinas looks at this and says, this must mean we're reaching out for something. There's something we want that would put all this desiring to rest. And so what he recommends is not just trying to get rid of those desires, but try to find some sort of ultimate fulfillment. And if that's going to be possible, if it's going to truly be possible to live a human life that experiences ultimate fulfillment, he thinks we need something beyond this world. That is precisely why we need God. That is the only way that our constant willing and striving and desiring can finally be put to rest. We can feel completely satisfied, and every single action we undertake in which we pursue something is just a sign or reflection that that is what we ultimately want in our deepest, in the deepest sense possible. So in any case, we see that Aquinas rejects any of these external goods as something that could be beatitude. So, given what I've just said about beatitude, how Aquinas sees beatitude as this ultimate fulfillment, you might think that what Aquinas is telling us is that really the ultimate good, what beatitude is a sort of pleasure or delight or enjoyment. Because when you think about your life and the constant striving and dissatisfaction we experience every day, and then you imagine a state in which you're completely fulfilled, you might say, well, this will be the most pleasurable state possible. And if that is the most pleasurable state possible, then perhaps we should say that what beatitude is pleasure or delight. Now, this is not Aquinas' view, although, as we're going to see, he does think beatitude is pleasurable, he does think it's enjoyable and the highest delight we can experience, but beatitude is not defined by those things. But first, in objection to his view, right, Aquinas' style of writing, he always considers various objections, and then he responds to those objections. One of the objections he considers spells out a very simple argument for just why it seems obvious that pleasure or delight or enjoyment would be our ultimate end. So the objection goes, since beatitude is the ultimate end, it is not desired for the sake of anything else, instead other things are desired for its sake. But this feature seems especially to belong to delight. For as Aristotle says in Ethics, Book 10, it is ridiculous to ask someone why he wants to be delighted. Therefore, so the objection goes, not Aquinas' view, but so the objection goes, beatitude consists especially in pleasure and delight. I think there's something fundamentally right about this, right? If you think about the nature of pleasure, if you ask someone, well, why do you want to experience pleasure? It just seems like a weird question to ask. Like, well, that just is what happiness is. That is what good, that is, it seems like the definition of a good thing. As Aristotle puts it, you would never ask someone why they want to be delighted. Well, what's the opposite? To experience pain? To experience discomfort, dissatisfaction? Of course, we need to experience those things at times, but it seems like we always do that for the sake of greater pleasure later on. So it just seems obvious on one view that pleasure might be our ultimate end. And in fact, as we'll see in the second half of this course when we look at utilitarianism, some philosophers have in fact said that the ultimate end of a human being is pleasure. Now, Aquinas rejects this view, but he doesn't do it because he doesn't think beatitude is pleasurable. In fact, beatitude, or this union with God, he thinks is the most pleasurable, delightful, the most enjoyable experience you could ever have. But pleasure just isn't what defines beatitude. Aquinas says, one should notice that every delight is a sort of proper accident which follows upon beatitude or some part of beatitude. So what does this mean? He says, well, he relies on this distinction between the essence of a thing and an accident. So an essence is what defines what a thing is, and an accident is just a property the thing might have, but doesn't need to have to be the sort of thing it is. So for instance, take a triangle, right? So for something to be a triangle, its essence is that it's a closed figure with three sides. But of course, every triangle has to have that, but not every triangle is the same color. Some triangles, you can imagine a black triangle or a red triangle or a yellow triangle, or right, whatever color. So the essence of a triangle is a closed figure with three sides, and an accident of a triangle could be what color it is. But then some accidents are, while they don't define the thing exactly, they always accompany it. So for instance, the idea that in a triangle, all the interior angles add up to 180 degrees. This is not maybe what defines what a triangle is, but it is also true of every single triangle. And he says the same thing about beatitude. What beatitude isn't pleasure. because ultimately pleasure is, as Aristotle said, something that we share with other sorts of species. It's not our ability to feel pleasure is not the respect in which we are a reflection of the image of God. So it can't be beatitude. But it's a proper accident of beatitude. It always accompanies beatitude. Right? So whenever you are in a state of beatitude, you'll be feeling pleasure. It's the ultimate satisfaction and enjoyment you could have. But pleasure isn't what defines beatitude. Instead, it has to be something else. So not even pleasure is exactly what Aquinas is searching for here. Now, Aquinas gives a helpful summary of all these points when he starts to ask the question, well, can we notice any common attributes or common characteristics of all these things I've said don't qualify as beatitude? And in fact, we see he characterizes all these things we've gone through so far: riches, honor, glory, fame, power, the body, pleasure, right? All these things are created goods. Now, what does that mean? They're goods that only exist because of God's creation. It's only because of human beings exist and human society exists that there's wealth, or that there is honor and glory, or that there's societal structures over which we can gain power. It's only because of our biological structure that we can feel pleasure, or the structure of our soul that we can feel pleasure. So all those goods are created in some sense. And the point he really wants to make here is that our good, beatitude, cannot lie in any created good. It's impossible for man's beatitude to lie in any created good. It would not be the ultimate end otherwise if something remained to be desired. Now, why does he say this? Well, think about the idea that some good is created. When something is created, then you say to yourself, well, why was it created? There must have been a reason or a purpose why this good is here if it in fact was created. If it wasn't created and it just came out about randomly in a haphazard fashion, then maybe you don't have to ask that question. But if it was a created good, it must have been made for some purpose. And if it was made for some purpose, then that means that there's something else beyond that good which is really more important. It's whatever the purpose is. So his point is that no created good can ultimately encapsulate our beatitude or the ultimate good for a human being. Instead, we need what he calls a universal good. And as you might guess, as I've been hinting at, what this universal good is God. And he describes this point in the following way. But the object of the will, which is man's appetite, is the universal good, just as the object of the intellect is universal truth. From this it is clear that nothing can put man's will to rest except the universal good. But the universal good is found only in God and not in any created good, since every creature has participated goodness. Hence, only God can satisfy man's will. It is in God alone that man's beatitude lies. And this is an important point, because remember earlier I said that Aquinas looks at the very structure of desiring and willing and striving for things and says, we are longing for something we can't get. Every day, of course, we long after and we pursue various created goods. And once we get one of those created goods, we want something else. And if all there was this world of created goods, that willing would never stop. Our appetite would never totally be satisfied. So what will satisfy it? Well, whatever is responsible for the presence of those goods, whatever makes them good. Now, as he's already said, look, power and riches and honor, these can be used for bad or ill. But to the extent that they are good because God has created them and God has made them for a purpose. As he puts it here again, every creature, every created good has participated goodness. A goodness it gets from participating in the overall plan and creation of God. And so for this reason, if we're looking for a universal good, a good beyond all these things, the good which makes all those things good in the first place, which explains why we're striving for them in the first place, has to be something beyond all those things. It has to be something from which all purpose derives, and for Aquinas, that is God. And what does this mean? It means that our beatitude is not something that we can have in this life. If God is the universal good, if God is beatitude, and we can only unite with God after we die, in the traditional Christian story, in a sort of afterlife or heaven, if that is the only time we can come into contact with God, then in this life we will always be to some extent dissatisfied. That doesn't mean there aren't better or worse ways to live in this life. Aquinas would say, of course, you should be virtuous, you should try to do the right thing, you should pursue created goods in the right way. But at the end of the day, we will, no matter how perfect a life we live now, we will never be completely and utterly satisfied. Our purpose will never be fulfilled. Now this is important because he brings up a further distinction here between perfect beatitude and imperfect beatitude. So perfect beatitude is what I've really defined beatitude as thus far. It's this perfect good that puts the appetite totally to rest. It's God. But he also talks about at certain points an imperfect beatitude, and that's a beatitude we can achieve to some extent in this life, although it won't be our perfect beatitude. So he says, in men who are in the state of the present life, the ultimate perfection is through an operation by which man is joined to God, but this operation cannot be continuous. By contrast, in the present life, we fall short of perfect beatitude to the extent that we fall short of oneness and continuity of such an operation. So in the life we live now, there are various ways we can try to come into contact with God, we can try to commune with God, we can contemplate God, that's very important. But because we live a life as a biological organism, because our body has certain needs, because we have needs as a member of society, as a member of our family, we cannot continually contemplate or unite with God in this life. And so, whatever beatitude we can have now will always be imperfect. And what does that imperfect beatitude look like? It looks like a contemplation of God, a contemplation of perfection. But of course, as Aquinas notes here, our lives don't allow us sufficient opportunity to do that all the time. He says, in the active life, which is occupied with so many things, there is less of the character of beatitude than there is in the contemplative life, which is centered on one thing, the contemplation of truth. So the best we can get, the strongest glimpse we can get of the ultimate beatitude we can achieve after our death is the continued and unbroken contemplation of God in this life. It requires philosophy and theology and thinking deeply about the nature of the divine. But look, we live active lives as well. Not all of us can live this sort of monkish life where we just retreat and contemplate these ultimate divine questions. You know, you might have a mortgage, you might have a family, you have to go to work, you have to exercise, you have to do all these things. We live an active life. And so we are forced to be occupied with many things. We're forced to be occupied with our desiring and our striving. And for that reason, the beatitude we can have in this life is simply imperfect. So, while the beatitude we can achieve in this life is imperfect, there is some good news. The good news is that perfect beatitude is possible. While in this life we can never engage in an eternal, continuous, and unbroken contemplation and union with God, that will be possible after we die. So Aquinas explains in this way, however, God has promised us perfect beatitude, when we will be like angels in heaven. Therefore, when applied to this perfect beatitude, the objection loses its force. For in this state of beatitude, man's mind will be joined to God by a single operation that is continuous and everlasting. And this is, the way he describes this union with God is important, because it's very common to talk about heaven, to talk about an afterlife. It's actually a little less common to think in really clear detail about what that will be like. Now, if Aquinas is right, what a afterlife or an existence in heaven couldn't be like is what our life is now, where we have a biological body that desires and wills and strives. Because the whole point of this existence after our death, this beatitude, is that it puts an end to all that striving. And so what heaven or this afterlife would have to be like, this union with God would have to be like, would be an existence very different from anything that we are really acquainted with, and something we only really get small snippets of in this life. He says it's a single operation, continuous and everlasting, and it's a state in which we are forever, for all time, eternally in the same state, doing the same thing, a single operation in which we're simply contemplating or communing or having this union with God. It's a union with the ultimate and divine perfection. And from Aquinas' point of view, it's the thing we have been striving for our entire lives, as we constantly strive after these created goods. And we consistently feel dissatisfied with our inability to fill all our appetites. All those appetites will only be filled after our death, when we finally have the single operation of continuous and everlasting union with the divine being. That, in any case, is Aquinas' view of Beatitude. So I will stop here. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.